everyone, and welcome to my Comparative Criminal Justice Systems Critical Assignment PowerPoint. My name is Larissa Ho'opai, and this is for Class CJS 497AE. Crime can be seen all the way back in the Bible, where the first homicide ever recorded was Abel being killed by his brother Cain, and ever since then, crime has been in our society. There's been need for criminal procedures and criminal codes to administer justice, and no two criminal justice systems are the same. And so today we're going to be comparing and contrasting 7 different countries: the United States, England, France, Germany, China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia. We're going to be looking at their historical development and how they came to the criminal codes and procedures that they have today. And we're going to be looking at how their law enforcement and policing system administers those criminal codes, and then we're going to be looking at an overall analysis of their criminal justice system and how effective it is based on their criminal statistics. Of course, we're all familiar with the United States. When they broke away from Europe and the founding fathers were trying to write out their governing doctrines, they wanted to steer away from the colonial structured society, which really didn't have any sort of criminal laws, and a centralized government and an oppressive monarchy. So the U.S. Constitution is the governing doctrine of the United States, and the Bill of Rights, which is the amendments of the Constitution, guarantee not only the rights of the citizen, but also the rights of the criminal, and it also outlines how trials ought to be run. Now, entities that deal with criminal matters, unlike most of the countries we're going to talk about, there's no one entity that deals with all of the criminal matters in the U.S. There's the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the CIA, as well as others. As far as their law enforcement is concerned, there's a bunch of law enforcements all around the country, and they operate at the federal, state, and local level. The first police department to be established was in the 1800s, and that was in Boston. And that gave way to a bunch of major cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago having their own law enforcement and police departments established. Today, there's over 18,000 law enforcement agencies nationwide. As far as crime statistics and their overall criminal justice system effectiveness in the US, there has been an overall decrease in crime in the past few years, but there has been a rise in firearm crimes, and part of the reason is because it's been noticeably easy to gain a firearms license as of late, and even illegally, it's becoming easier and easier. So that's something that the US is definitely going to have to address in the future. Henry II is known as the father of the common law legal system, and this is one of the biggest things that came out of England's political and criminal history, and we can see that the common law is in many criminal justice systems today. Some of their key documents include the England's Bill of Rights, which was created in the 1600s to reverse the corruption that England had suffered at the hands of James II. And then around a century later, the Prisoners Act was passed to help with the format of trials and how they were run, and to allow counsel for defendants, because up until that point, counsel was more of an optional thing rather than a guaranteed right. As far as their law enforcement, Robert Peel had a lot to do with modernization of policing, not only in England but also in the US. And some of their biggest police forces is the Metropolitan Police Force and the London Police Force. And in each of their kind of prefectures or states, they have also local police forces similar to the US. And the London Police Force and the Metropolitan Police Force kind of work as a federal government of sorts to oversee the local agencies in each area. And one of Robert Peel's biggest contributions and reforms is the concept of community policing, in which he encouraged that if police people or police officers would become friends with the community and would gain their trust, crime would ultimately go down. And this is a very common theme that we see in today's policing philosophies. Their crime statistics and criminal justice effectiveness overall, they've seen an overall decrease in crime since the 1990s. However, England has stated that there is a lack of communication between the different entities in their criminal justice system, such as law enforcement, courts, and corrections, and so there tends to be a lot of extra wastage as far as resources and time. And so, one of the things that England can definitely improve on is communicating between these different agencies to make their system that much more effective. But it's good to see that there has been an overall decrease. France suffered under a centralized government and oppressive monarchy for a long time, so there was need for a political and social change. And one of the things that instigated this change was the Baron of Montesquieu writing The Spirit of the Law, which there's another name for it, but I can't pronounce it. And these basically brought up the ideas of criminal procedure and the need for separation of powers, which is revolutionary in that time period of France's history, but we can see that it's quite effective in the US and their US Constitution. And then the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and Citizen were passed by the Parliament sometime later that basically reinforced the ideas of the spirit of the law. And it dealt with fundamental human rights and liberties, and there was also several articles within them that dealt with the need for criminal procedure. And some of the things that it dealt with was their law enforcement. So France has two different types of law enforcement. They have the National Police Force, and they also have their gendarmerie. Now, the National Police Force is more of a community police force, so they deal with a lot of civilian matters and public safety, whereas the gendarmerie acts more in a law enforcement matter, doing more arrests and investigations. And they also work kind of in a military sense, and so they do a lot of patrol and things like that. As of 2014, both forces have been under a single entity with the acronym SAELSI, the Interior Security Purchase Equipment and Logistics Services. So then, if we go into their criminal statistics and their overall system effectiveness, there has been an overall decrease in nonviolent and property crimes, but there has been an increase in violent crimes. So we're not really sure if this new merger that between the two police forces has been the most effective change for France, but because it's still relatively new, we'll have to wait and see if their statistics and especially violent crimes go down over the years. Germany is a relatively new country established when Otto von Bismarck unified the 39 loosely associated states with each other. He was the prime minister of Prussia at the time, so he used his own criminal code, which you can see on the slide, but I'm not even going to try to pronounce, for all of Germany's basic criminal procedures. Eventually, after World War II, when Germany was split into three parts, the part that was controlled by the US and the European areas took the constitution that they used for there and they applied it to all of the newly unified Germany, which is now known as Germany's Basic Law. Germany's Basic Law has all of their basic criminal functions and all of their human rights guidelines written on there. As far as their law enforcement is concerned, there's the SHUPO, who handles first responder duties and also handles basic criminal investigations. And then they also have the CRIPO, and who conduct serious investigations in violent crimes. They also have a federal police force in Germany that oversee um, all of their big international things, and they oversee the CRIPO and the SHUPO together, and they're controlled under the Ministry of the Interior. As far as their crime statistics and their criminal justice effectiveness, they've seen the lowest crime rate since 1992. But there have been an influx of immigrants and refugees that have come in, especially in the last few years as a result of the Syrian war. So there's a lot of Syrian refugees there, and there may be some unknown crime statistics with those people. But overall, they've come a really long way as far as their crime rates and their criminal codes. China's history is mostly ruled by dynasties and emperors, and there was no sort of formal criminal code for them for a really long time. And then Confucian philosophy came into the picture around 6th century AD, which again did not establish any formal criminal codes, but it also shifted China's thinking to that of a collective and in the natural goodness of human beings, and how society is the most important aspect. And then when the People's Republic of China was established in the 1940s, they realized that they needed to have some sort of criminal code in place, some sort of formal code that would serve as their guidelines. So that's when they established the Criminal Procedural Code. And one of the biggest changes that came about with their code is their presumption of innocence in trials, because up until that point, they had kind of treated everyone as a criminal, dishonoring to their society, I guess. And then, as far as their law enforcement is concerned, there are speculations that their police are a little bit corrupt because they are operated under the Ministry of the Public Security, who are associated with the local politicians of the Communist Party. And so there are speculations that they kind of just do whatever is best for the party as opposed to what's best for the people. And they're a lot more concerned with public order versus crime prevention. As for their crime statistics and criminal justice system effectiveness, there's not a lot of numbers to be had because China is so private about these things, but there seems to be a violent crime decrease, particularly with firearms in China, because it's so difficult to get a firearm even illegally. And China is also known for having surveillance on all of their citizens, and so because of this, there is an unknown statistic on democratic protests and how the police deal with them. But of course, China doesn't want the public to know that, and so we don't really have any numbers on there. Similar to China, Japan has a history of dynasties and emperors with no criminal code in place, although there are records to indicate that Prince Shotoku around 604 AD attempted to create a criminal code, but he never properly established it. After the Meiji Restoration, hundreds of years later, Japan recognized their need to have some sort of criminal code in place, but there was nothing to go off of, so they adopted the French Penal Code, whose ideas have kind of remained within Japan criminal codes even today. In the 1940s, they recognized their need to create their own criminal procedures on top of the French Penal Code, so they created the Code of Criminal Procedure of 1948 and the Rules of Criminal Procedure of 1949. And these really stay true to the Anglo-American traditions of law, so this is human rights, presumption of innocence, and basic guidelines for how criminal trials ought to be run and what rights the criminal has. As far as their law enforcement, their policing is controlled by the National Police Agency of Japan that kind of oversees all of the local prefectures that each have their own police force. And for policing in Japan, community relations is incredibly important, and to them, it's the key to crime prevention. And for them, it seems to work incredibly well. As far as their crime statistics and CGS effectiveness, they remain to be one of the lowest crime rates in the world. They have seen a slight increase in violent crimes, specifically with knives over the last few years. But comparing their statistics of knife crimes compared to, say, America's firearms crimes, they're still remarkably low. And so Japan is still a very, very safe country to go to. Of all the countries that we've talked about today, there's none that's as religiously charged in their political and their government realm as Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is known as the land of the founding of Islam by the Prophet Muhammad, and the Islamic law, or the Sharia, continues to be their governing doctrines even today. As far as their criminal procedures are concerned, there are no formal criminal codes, and they again look to the Islamic law for that, particularly in the Sunnah and the Quran, where there's allegedly inspirations from God on how to handle criminal trials and criminal proceedings. As far as their law enforcement is concerned, they are controlled by the Director of the Public Safety, who is associated with the Ministry of Interior. They have local police forces in each area, and there's two types of law enforcement officers. The first is the Mubahith, which act as Western police forces, so they handle criminal investigations and make arrests and other public safety matters. And then there's the Mutawa, who are the religious police. They don't have as much law enforcement power per se, but they do still act as guides to a certain extent to help their citizens become allegedly better Muslims. Although there have been a lot of instances in the past few years in which Mutawa officials have tried to force certain Muslim beliefs on their citizens, and so in 2016 they got their power stripped of them, at least as law enforcement officers, but they still have their title. As far as their crime statistics and overall criminal justice effectiveness, it is a little bit difficult to get numbers on them as it was with China, but numbers do indicate that they still have a very, very low crime rate, similar to Japan, and this could be possibly credited to the fact that their Islamic law is so harsh on criminals, and so it's incentive enough to not commit crime. Although there are numbers to indicate that there is a slight increase in crime between 2000 and 2017, but overall it still appears to be incredibly low. We have seen how different societies handle crime and punishment, and unfortunately, how no system is absolutely perfect. Crime is the result of sin, and sin's entrance to the earth can be seen back in Genesis when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. As long as the earth spins, there will always be sin, and therefore there will always be crime. It seems like a hopeless situation, but it's not. We celebrated just this past week that Jesus came to the earth over 2,000 years ago to die on the cross, to take that punishment of the sins that we have committed. And in turn, his commandment to us was to love others as he had loved us. John 13:34 and 35 says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." As criminal justice workers, we have a unique burden to spread God's love to the least of these, to those that society has deemed to be unfit and unworthy to live a normal and loved life. So today I hope you learned a little bit about different criminal justice systems around the world. And even though none of them are perfect and crime will never be completely eradicated, we have hope in the fact that God still loves us and he still loves all of those, even if it seems like they don't deserve it. Because in reality, those are the ones that need it the most.